Science is how we turn the unknown into the understood. But even with everything we've learned, the world is still packed with mysteries. And the prehistoric ocean might be one of the biggest. We've found the fossils. We can measure the bones, the shells, the teeth. But for some of these creatures, we're still piecing together the basics. How they moved through the water, how they caught prey, and what their bodies were even built to do. Today, we're diving into 5 prehistoric sea creatures that scientists are still trying to figure out. Our first creature lived more than 450 million years ago during the Ordovician period. Its name was Camarasaurus, meaning chambered horn. This was a cephalopod, related to modern squid and nautilus, but instead of a coiled shell, it carried a long, straight cone. Modern estimates place that shell at around 6 meters long. Fossils have been found across North America, Europe, and China, suggesting it lived in shallow tropical seas across much of the ancient world. Here's the problem. Only the shell fossilizes. The soft body has to be reconstructed. Based on living cephalopods, Camarasaurus likely had a soft, muscular head extending from the shell opening, tentacles used to grasp prey, a hard beak capable of biting through shells or exoskeletons, and a siphuncle running through internal chambers to regulate buoyancy. So broadly, we have a working picture of what it may have looked like, but there are still major questions scientists are actively debating. How did it actually move through the water? How large did it really get? Was it an active predator or more of a slow, hovering ambush hunter? Those aren't minor details. They completely change how we picture the Ordovician ocean. Take movement. Jet propulsion works well for compact bodies like squid, but stretch that body into a 6-meter rigid cone and the physics change. Long shells create drag. They resist turning. They destabilize horizontal swimming. So was Camarasaurus cruising through open water or hovering vertically, drifting and striking from above? We can model it, we can simulate it, but without preserved soft tissue, we can't test it directly. Then there's size. For decades, Camarasaurus was described as the largest orthocone ever discovered, sometimes estimated at 9 or even 11 meters long. But more recent studies suggest some of those enormous fossils may belong to a related genus, Endocerus, and some extreme estimates were based on fragmentary material. So even its maximum size is still under revision, which means this animal might have been a towering apex predator or something slightly smaller and biomechanically constrained. And that difference changes the entire ecosystem around it. Next on our list is another cephalopod, but from a very different ocean and a very different time. Tusoteuthis, the so-called giant squid of the Cretaceous Western Interior Seaway. Tusoteuthis is an extinct cephalopod that lived in the inland sea that once split North America in two. It's often described as a giant squid, but based on the shape of its internal shell, or pen, it was probably closer to modern octopuses and vampire squid than to true squids. Like most soft-bodied cephalopods, it didn't leave a full skeleton. What we actually find are those internal shells preserved in the chalk and shale, some of them approaching 2 meters long, which implies a large animal sharing the water with sharks, plesiosaurs, mosasaurs, and fast-moving predatory fish. For a long time, many of these internal shells were labeled as Tusoteuthis, but as of 2019, only one poorly preserved specimen from Kansas is still formally recognized as Tusoteuthis longa, and even that is likely a dubious name. Several of the largest Better preserved specimens have been reassigned to a related genus, Encoteuthis. So broadly, we have a working outline. A big, muscular cephalopod with a stiff internal shell, a strong mantle, multiple arms and tentacles, and a beak capable of taking on sizable prey. Encoteuthids like Tusoteuthis are generally interpreted as active predators rather than sluggish drifters. But there are still key things scientists are trying to understand. How big did these animals actually get? What did their bodies really look like in life? Long and slender, like a modern giant squid, or shorter and bulkier, like a vampire squid? And given that body shape, how exactly did they swim and hunt in the Western Interior Seaway? The size question comes from the fact that we're scaling an entire animal from a single internal piece. The length of the pen is real. The rest of the body has to be estimated. If you assume giant squid proportions, you end up with a total length over 8 meters. If you assume a shorter, deeper body, more like a vampire squid, the animal becomes shorter overall, but much more compact and powerful. That choice changes not just the number on paper, but the kind of prey it could reasonably tackle and how it would move. The body shape and movement questions are tied to the same problem. These internal shells are more robust than those of modern deep-sea vampire squid, which suggests strong muscle attachments and a fairly active swimmer. But we don't have the outline of the mantle, the fins, or the exact arm arrangement. A long, narrow animal would swim and hunt differently from a shorter, wider one. On top of that, the name Tusoteuthis has been used for more than one kind of internal shell and is now being narrowed and revised, so some classic Tusoteuthis reconstructions probably mix traits from several related animals. All of that means we can say there were large, active, soft-bodied cephalopods in this sea, but their true size, exact body plan, and hunting style are still very much open questions. Next up is a marine reptile called Tanistropheus. It lived about 242 million years ago in the Middle Triassic, along the coasts of the ancient Tethys Sea. Picture a low, lizard-like body, a long tail, and then a neck that's almost 3 times the length of its torso. The largest species stretched to around 6 meters or 20 feet, with roughly half of that taken up by neck alone. That incredible neck was built from just 13 vertebrae, each one stretched into a long, stiff beam and reinforced with bony rods running along the underside. Most of its fossils come from shallow marine rocks in what's now Europe and China. For a long time, those bones caused more confusion than clarity. Some skeletons were huge, some were only about 1.5 meters long, and for decades, no one was sure if the smaller ones were juveniles or a second species. CT scans of crushed skulls and microscopic growth rings in the bones finally sorted that out. Today, we recognize at least 2 species living side by side. A larger form with long, conical teeth suited to grabbing fish and squid-like animals, and a smaller form with more complex teeth, likely better at gripping small shelled prey, like shrimp. But there are still major questions scientists are trying to answer. How much time did it actually spend in the water versus on land? How did it really move when it was swimming? And what was that extreme neck doing in day-to-day life? Slow, stealth approaches, sudden sideways strikes, or something in between? Those details are still debated because the skeleton sends mixed signals. The skull, nostril placement, and teeth all point to a marine ambush hunter, waiting in the shallows for fish and cephalopods to come within range. But the limbs and hips look surprisingly normal for a land reptile, and the tail isn't shaped like a classic swimming fin. That leaves room for different interpretations: fully aquatic, mostly aquatic but shore-capable, or a true in-between that hunted from the water's edge. Swimming style is another open problem. The neck is so stiff and heavily braced that it wouldn't have been whipping around like a snake. The tail has some muscle attachments for side-to-side motion, and the hind limbs were strong enough for powerful kicks, but no single feature screams, "This is how it swam." And then there's how the neck was actually used in real hunts. With that much bone and so little flexibility, it probably wasn't constantly swinging. One idea is that Tanystropheus kept its heavy body farther back and pushed just the head and neck into schools of prey, striking with minimal movement in the rest of the body. Another is that it used the neck more like a rigid boom, lining up the head and then making small, precise adjustments. Without soft tissue or a living animal to watch, we're stuck combining bone, physics, and modern analogues. And that's why this thing is still one of the most argued about reptiles of the Triassic. Next on our list is Drepanaspas, a very flat, very armored little vertebrate from the early Devonian. Picture something about the size of a dinner plate pressed low against the seafloor, with its body encased in a broad, bony shield. That shield was made of overlapping plates covered in tiny V-shaped ridges, and the eyes sat wide apart toward the top. Instead of a forward-facing mouth, Drepanaspas had a narrow slit that opened along the front of the shield and slightly upward, lined with tiny denticles that would have helped grip food. Most fossils come from shallow marine deposits in places like Germany and Luxembourg, where its plates are preserved in fine detail while the rest of the body is mostly lost. But there are still key things scientists are trying to understand. How exactly did Drepanaspas feed? Was it a gentle sediment sipper, a more forceful suction feeder, or something in between? What precisely are those V-shaped ridges and grooves doing? Are they just ornament on the armor, or do they mark a lateral line-style sensory canal system running through the plates? And where, exactly, does Drepanaspas fall on the early vertebrate family tree? How close is it to the bigger Samasteids and to other early armored jawless vertebrates that shaped the path toward later fishes? The feeding question matters because it tells us what job Drepanaspas actually had in those shallow seas. A slow, suction-feeding bottom grazer supports one kind of ecosystem, with armored, jawless fishes quietly cleaning up invertebrates from the mud. A more forceful, targeted feeder might have gone after larger, more mobile prey, changing how energy moved along the seafloor food web. We're trying to reconstruct not just the animal, but how busy and complex those Devonian seafloors already were. The ridge and sensory question is about how sophisticated its situational awareness was under all that armor. If those V-shaped ridges really line up with a sensory canal system, then Drepanaspas was effectively wired to feel tiny water movements through its bony shield, letting it detect prey, predators, or currents while staying low and protected. If they're mostly growth patterns or surface texture, then its sensory world may have been more limited, and the evolution of that lateral line sensitivity might need to be pushed forward into other groups. And the family tree question ties Drepanaspas into the bigger story of how early vertebrates experimented with armor, head support, and life on the bottom. Pinning down exactly where it sits relative to later giant Samasteids and other jawless vertebrates helps us see whether small, flat, armored bottom feeder with an odd mouth was a brief side branch or an important stepping stone toward the more extreme shield-bodied forms and eventually toward the more flexible, jawed fishes that remake these ecosystems later on.
The farther you look back in time,
The harder the mysteries are to crack. These are just 4 of the unanswered questions the prehistoric ocean has given us, and there are many more still waiting to be solved. If you want to keep uncovering more mysteries from the prehistoric world, hit like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss what comes next.